Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANS processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. And let's just change the picture here. And we're going to be right there. So this is part of the Cash American Knowledge Team meeting of 2025. But as we all know, we are broadcasting on 6 continents, possibly 7 and possibly beyond. But, you know, who's to know? So anyway, let's see where we're at here. Just, uh-oh, I've lost my, oh, there it is. Look at that. Another update from Zoom here, and a few changes that we have to get adapted to. Okay. We'll get it. We'll understand very shortly. So this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We're discussing the intermediate GANS tech. The subject today is counterweight. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It's October the 26th of 2025. And this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So let us remember that we are all teachers in this process, and we're also all students. And so this is an ongoing process, and we have been trying to condense all the knowledge, and we keep stuffing the can here with many more classes, but it outlines a progression in terms of our understanding, because this public teaching is trying to bring together the knowledge for the newcomers, and without, shall we say, boring the mature knowledge seekers. The point of the matter is that we have new points of view, new ways of explaining things, and the thing is that each and every one of us has a degree of understanding and a way of conversing. And so this is what's important. Take what you need to be able to explain it. Stay within your own capabilities, and make sure that what your intention is to convey the information in a useful way, so that we can all achieve that practical application of enjoying peace and prosperity on this planet. So these are in scientific terms outlined in the books by Marin Tavakoli-Kesh, such as book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter. And this is very important for us to discuss matter because this is how the scientific community relates to our existence. And so we see the matter state is a combination of these three energy states of matter, dark matter, and antimatter. They come together and they create the matter. And so what we're looking at is the product of this coming together. And we know this is a product because we have the structure of light in book number 2, which shows that there are two matters at least, because the light has to travel between them. So now the creation of matter involves more than one. And how many more? Well, all we have to do is look up in the sky and see all the stars, and to see all the stars in the Milky Way and the galaxy and the universe. And then this leads us to book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, where we see the breakup of one field splitting up into two fields, of which one is our universe, man's universe. That's what we see. There is another universe, our sister universe, which by the end of today's discussion, you will understand that that is the counterweight to our universe. So, although it's unseen and it's not often discussed, but what is discussed is for 400 weeks in a row, Rick Crammond and the Universal Council from planet Earth have been bringing together one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace, because this is the ticket. This is the traveling ticket to get to outer space and to join the universal community. And did we know that that is our objective? Did we know that that even exists? Well, we have to understand that there has to be a counterweight somewhere to allow that to happen. And so this leads us to the plasma rule, where we have been adopting a position where the higher strength eats the weaker strength, or the higher strength beats the weaker strength. And so that area of interaction becomes the transaction zone. So is that zone a point of conflict, or is it a binding zone? Either way, it's an inertia density manifestation. And so in this process, we need to explain what that means. So energy binding is very, very important for the purposes of our self-serving needs. And these self-serving needs revolve around the dimension point. Problem with this dimension point is that it is at the expense of others. And allow me to adjust the screen here because we have done something wrong, so that we can see what's going on. There we go. So that's the point. It's at the expense of others. And we see a lot of profit in that, don't we? Because our esteem, our prestige, our position in life is kind of measured around our so-called success. And the measurement that we use for success is money. So, the more money we have, the more prestige and power we have. And then, of course, there's two ways to achieve that. You make more or you steal more. And it seems to be easier to steal because the other that you steal from then becomes lesser. And so if you want to be more, you can do more, be more, or you can take it from someone else to do less and be less. And so this is the fallacy that we've been accustomed to. And the reason I say it's a fallacy is because it implies a success. Many of us measure our success by the amount of money that we have, but we don't think there are any penalties in our bad behavior. And so our general bad behavior is dictated by what we call the war pigs. As we know, this is a balance, counterweight between power and people. So the power of a few govern the people of many. And of course, the fallacy in this is that they're fighting for peace. So the ways and means that you want to achieve something is the ways and means of the, shall we say, the intent. So if your intent is peace, the ways and means of fighting is not very peaceful. And does it have to be at such extremes? Is peace a counterweight for fighting? Or can we say that fighting is a counterweight for peace? Well, the war pigs would have us believe that. So is it not possible to achieve peace and prosperity in peaceful manner? So, we have now a very important event coming, and I say it's an important event. It's not really an important event, but they make it an important event because there is a commercial benefit that is derived from this. And for some companies, Halloween is one of the most lucrative days of the year. And what it indicates really is how many people have bought into that system. And what we see is that it is kind of they turn this into war pumpkins, actually. We call them jack-o'-lanterns, and it's kind of fun to carve out a pumpkin and then put a candlelight in there. And then we have all these witches and goblins, and the whole purpose of that is to kind of instill that eeriness, that fearfulness, that make-believe world where we get scared. And so we dress up our homes to be, oh, so scary. And we invest an enormous amount. And then we do all these other things that go along with it. But as we realize, the reason there's so many people participating in this is because they have bought into that system. So where's the counterweight to that? Well, one of my favorite games used to be a game called Sortigo, which is a chess-like strategy board game for 2 players, and each player controls 40 pieces. And these players have the ranks like of an army, and at the head of the army is the marshal. And so when the pieces attack each other, very simply, the higher rank wins. But interestingly enough, the highest rank, the marshal, beats everybody as long as the marshal is attacking. And so if we look at the Crusades and how if we remember King James and these other kings in our Crusade times back around the 1100s and 1200s, they used to lead the charge. That's kind of different from the kings of today who kind of let you lead the charge. They just give the orders. But interestingly enough, there are spies, and these spies, if they come in contact with the marshal, can defeat the marshal. Although the spy in this particular game is the lowest of the lowest. And everyone can take out the spy. Very interesting game. The main reason I liked it is because it didn't involve dice. It was a strategy game. And of course, the strategy game of all games is chess. And where we have kings and queens, and we can see all the players, and we can see the chessboard. And then, of course, we have pawns and strategies that go around that. So there's nothing hidden like in Stratego. Everything is out in the open, and yet it still remains a competition. But the whole point is to capture the other team's king. So in effect, it's another war game. And so these games can be fun, but they involve conflict, don't they? And then, of course, everyone's favorite game, Monopoly, where we have landlords and serfs. And of course, the winner bankrupts the other players. And there's one thing that I've noticed with respect to that game, and it's kind of fun to play, but in the end, one winner bankrupts the others, and the others have this enormous resentment. And so I've never found that game to be very satisfying in its conclusion. It's only fun while we're playing because we're exchanging money and buying properties and rolling the dice. But it nevertheless becomes a game of conquest. So there is a kind of conflict. And if we were to look at what we call terracing, an easy way for us to move things is let it flow. And so if we were looking at two reservoirs here and there's no flow connection, in order to begin that, you need an external pump to start the flow. And so the pipe connecting the two is the transaction zone. But the key thing here is that you need an external pump. But what we find that once you complete that terracing action, there's a connection by gravity. It creates a falling gradient. And so this pump connecting the two reservoirs is a transaction zone. And you don't need a pump to pump it down the transaction zone, but you do need to maintain the upper reservoir so that the water can flow. So it doesn't need an external force to go through the transaction zone. That is the point. The water coming out of the hose is a counterweight for the water coming into the hose. And so this is one form of understanding angular density because it's falling and we fall into increased density, which causes increased pressure. And of course, this is all related to gravity. But from the plasma point of view, it's an increased dependence on Earth space feeding. And so that internal pressure is like a popcorn and it creates a GANS within us. And that GANS has a tensity. That tensity is the physical bag that we live in. And as we occupy that bag, we have fallen in. We are fallen angels, or so they have us believe. But you see, angular momentum is conserved. So if there are fallen angels, then the question is, where did they fall from? And what is the counterbalance to that? So this is the louche dilemma, you see, because when we're harvesting this louche, it's stealing the honey from someone else. It's stealing your honey. That's where our single-minded intention, as it's repeated, becomes a hive mind intention. And then that gets ingrained as a GANS intention. And that's the thing. That is one of the reasons we're not allowed to join the universal community, because they don't see our actions, they see our intention. And that intention is conveyed emotionally via the GANS. And so that becomes the counterbalance. to what we have. And you wonder, well, why are things the way they are? Why do we need more vitality? Because we're used to being and growing and becoming old and decrepit. But now we're finding that those two words don't necessarily belong in the same sentence. In fact, we can substitute the old for young. And so we still become decrepit as a loose leaker, but instead of being old, we can become young in that process. Either way, it drains our vitality. So what we're looking at with the plasma science is to enhance the vitality. And of course, we need a balance between the emotional and the physical parts of our existence. And that is and acts as a counterweight because one is dependent on the other. You cannot exclude them from your existence. So when we look at the Ten Commandments, we find that we as humans were given these 10 commandments, and then there were missing commandments. And then, of course, number 11 is my favorite because it's the most destructive as I see it. Thou shalt not lie. Well, many of us do, and we don't see the consequences. And so we are missing the obvious counterbalance. But the shocking detail comes when we lie to ourselves. And there we definitely see the consequences, although we refuse to admit it because it saps our vitality, both emotionally and physically. So we just seem because we can get along and get away with lying to others, we somehow fool ourselves into believing that we can lie to ourselves to get away with that. Well, that's actually false because the GANS itself has a truthfulness to it. So we wonder why there's no poker playing in outer space because that's a game of liars. So it becomes a truth seeker's dilemma when you have an accountability to yourself. So do you accuse others of lying or do you have to shield yourselves from the others? But the liars also have a dilemma because they have to have an accountability to their soul. And so in that regard, do you quit lying or do you suffer the consequences? Because in all cases, there are consequences. And that is the counterweight to that action. So our ability to get on the transmutation highway needs to have this balance, needs to have this counterweight. So when we're operating on the transmission highway, which involves frequency, pressure, and heat, and to get to the transmutation highway, we have to drop one level and move one up. And so there's a transition highway in between. The reason it's a transition highway is because now we've moved up one level and we can continue to move up to another level, but we can also move down. So, and if we move up, we would go to the transmutation highway, which goes from the carbon 14 to the carbon 16, and it means it's at a higher energy state. So each bump up is out of a higher energy, and each step down is towards the manifestation of inertia density manifestation, which we call physicality. So that migration is constantly in motion, and we got a chance to see it. We got a chance to do it. We got a chance to be plasma scientists. We were forced to make the cups of life. And poignantly, they weren't called the cups of the pandemic because they demonstrated to us the nanocoding process of the monatomic science. And that monatomic science had points on it, and it demonstrated our inner space emotional strength. And we manifested emotional GANS and physical GANS in two separate cups. And then we created many other GANSs like CO2 and calcium and zinc and copper and water and amino acid. And now we've been able to create gold GANs. And these are all part of this radiance manifestation. So this is all a representation of energy. And we get to see the product of it. And we try and understand the relationship to our physical product, which our physical product comes from the cup of the universe. So when we bring the copper GANS, which is physical, and the zinc GANS, which is emotional, and bring it together with the carbogen, which is our connection to the universe, so we have these three fields coming together, and so that becomes the counterweight, except that we also have a physicality. So interestingly enough, our brain is a counterweight to our physicality, because these cups are different, and yet they are in balance. And we know they're in the balance because most of us have a brain and we walk around. So these relationships represent the magnetical and gravitational relationship and the soul radiance, which comes from within. But it isn't manifest in its physicality until it comes together with the earth cup, which is an environment. And so that cup relationship with the environment cup is inertia. And that inertia is always the coming together of two fields, and the coming together of these two fields, in general terms, is an inertia density manifestation. But we've seen these fields sometimes explode, and that creates an interesting concept. So why is it sometimes increasing towards density and other times exploding? Well, it's always doing that because there's always a counterweight. So when we talk about susceptibility of maintaining that counterweight, we know that something is something and nothing is nothing. If it's nothing, it doesn't exist. But if it's something, it's always something as opposed to being something else. And so when we look at the GANS in its basic form, and we look at the top of the cup that holds the GANS, and we look through the water in the bottom, we can start to see that transaction zone forming a circular pattern. And then we look at the carafe on the right, well, that transaction zone literally displaces the GANS and creates a hole in that GANS. So we still have the GANS, but now we see that there's a dynamic action taking place. So where's that energy coming from? What is the counterweight to that action? Because there's no pump, there's no terracing, there's no hose connecting it. It's just sitting there. And yet there's plenty of action. We have air, water, glass, GANS, and a hole in the GANS. So this is all part of the transaction zone. Well, what exactly are we transacting? So in the plasma science, we say the two forces come together and they create a field. And so the kinds of forces and how they come together determines the susceptibility in singularity, which is to say anything can be created when two forces come together. So it all depends on, shall we say, the field strength. But when we look at the susceptibility in duality, here we find that we can have rotating balls, which are physical, and they create plasma fields, which are non-physical, and then collectively in a star formation, we find that we can create a plasma in the center, another transaction zone. And that is created from all the other fields. So, however, there's no external pump. There's no terracing. There's no connecting hose. So then we find the mystery of the nano alignment when we take the copper wire and nanocoat it. But it's not copper, it's carbon nanocrystals. And when they have a field alignment, then we create a magnetical field. And in its relationship with the gravitational inertia point, which is at the core, and the field alignment, now we have a direction of flow. Well, isn't that interesting? But where's the pump? Where's the connection? Where's the pressure coming from? And so this leads us to the conservation of energy. So what we have to understand is that this energy can flow from one state to another state. So it can stay within one state where we have a magnetical gravitational balance and equal a magnetical gravitational balance on the other side. However, we can also go from a GANS state to a nano state and still have a balance. And in fact, we can go from the GANS state to the atomic state and still have a balance. And we can reverse that procedure and still have a balance. So where is the counterweight? Because there's no pump. There's no external pressure. We're able to do this through the inertia field density manifestation. So if we understand that the GANS itself is like a popcorn where it kind of explodes. It's a gas in the center, but it expands and has not only a negative charge, but many, many points on that negative charge. And the negative charge is magnetical. So at the core, because of the many, many magnetical charges, there has to be a much, much stronger positive charge in the gravitational core. So the actual GANS explosion has to be balanced. So the many negatively charged points have a counterweight in the enhanced positive charge of the gravitational force. We didn't need a pump to do this. We did it plasmatically. So we went from the nanocoating to the GANS, which is GANS as a nanosolid, isn't it? So when we look at Earth matter, and we have to ask ourselves, is this a transaction in singularity or in duality? Because when we look at manifestation of the inertia density, it can be an element. And that element is a product of a substructure. And that's what we have to understand. The counterweight is in that substructure. And so when we look at the various GANSs that we can create, again, we ask, are those in singularity or in duality? Well, when we look at the GANSs, they are always in duality because they're not just molecular, they're polyatomic. So they're always tied together with either an oxygen or a hydrogen, as far as I know. Because those are two of the fundamental components of life on this planet. We know that when water and oxygen come together in their duality, then we have water. So all of this comes about from the nuclear feeding inertia. And so all of the components that we have are just fragments of the complexity. And each of these fragments are gravitationally stable. And these fragments can move into different dimensions. There's a dimensional portability. And wherever they go, they create this dimension point. But regardless of where they are, it's at least three fields coming together to create in balance a field of that triple strength. But it's more than three because we don't lose the first three. So it looks like it's four. But how you split up the four determines the counterweight, determines the balance. In fact, it also determines the susceptibility in the direction of flow. And that is one of the reasons why we have so many details in the Earth space that show the periodic table of physical matter. We have our familiar amino acid, hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, and our familiar copper and zinc, and our familiar iron, and of course our familiar sodium chloride and magnesium and calcium and potassium chloride. But now we're seeing the rest of it is also made the same way. And we ventured into the gold, and which is representative of the same substructure. That substructure is the counterweight. And we've been using that as an example of the manifestation. So our understanding of motion, we look at it as a rolling singularity. So we have an input rotation perpendicular to the motion. This gives us that x-axis transmission. So that input rotation is just like that water pump. And the output motion is aligned with the rotation. That's just like the hose connecting the two reservoirs. And so we have a motion. But if we introduce a slope, this is the y-axis dimension because now we're traversing across flux lines into the density. We're rolling towards density. We don't need the pump. We don't need the engine running because there's no perpendicular input rotation. It's just rolling down the hill. But if we want to keep moving, then we have to have this input rotation carrying on. So we can, in fact, get motion. And so when we look at a car and it's driving, what is the difference in the position? Well, it has to cross this transaction zone. And what exactly is happening in that transaction zone? Because one moment it's here and one moment it's there. So there has to have been a give and take of energy. And we simplify it and say, well, there's gas in the gas tank and the driver is stepping on the gas pedal. And so these are inputs that are affecting the perpendicular motion. But is that the only thing that is going on? Or is there some other kind of counterweight that's happening? Because we have the same thing happening on a slope. But the thing is, we can roll down, and as long as we still have the engine running and the gas pedal and the gas in the tank, we can go up the hill as well. So we have a downward trend and an upward trend. And either way, we're crossing flux lines. So the counterweight to traveling allows us to go through peaks and valleys, and there has to be a pivot. And so this slope, it leads us by attraction. So whether we're sloped downwards, we're downwardly attracted, or if we slope upwards, we're upwardly attracted. I say, well, I'm just stepping on the gas and I don't see the attraction. Well, you see the motion. You've seen the motion without the motor, without the gas, and you see the motion with the engine and with the gas. And the two operate the same way. But in one way, you deny the attraction, and the other way, you accept the attraction. So we all like to play a game when we were kids, the teeter-totter. You're on a pivot, and that pivot is the fulcrum that allows you to teeter and totter. But since there's a balance on two sides, how do you move? Well, the one at the bottom has to literally push up with his feet. Well, what happens if you have one heavyweight on one side and a lightweight on the other side? How do you teeter and totter? You just push up with your feet, and you have to push up harder if the other is lighter. Wait a second. Wouldn't you have to push up harder if the other was heavier? No, because the other is a counterweight. And because of the gravitational intensity, you don't have to push up as hard to bring down the bigger. But the bigger has to push up a lot harder to bring down the lighter because it does not have the gravitational counterweight. And furthermore, the big boy is his own counterweight. So instead of just having fun going up and down, apply the scientific principles, and then you'll see how the transaction is done. And it's all based on counterweight. So the mag-grab itself is as a counterweight. So we ascribe to this field capture in singularity. And we've said that this is angular momentum, angular density, and that we are fallen angels. Maybe we're arrived angels, and we are passing through these flux lines of gravity. So your understanding of this motion is understanding that in each case, a mag-grav is at play, but the way it moves is as a counterweight, because the mag-grav that is traveling is counterweight by another mag-grav. And that mag-grav may not be in singularity, but in duality. This you have to understand when we look at the GANS counterweight. So when we made the cup and made the GANS, and the GANS we put in the water, and we found most of the GANS would sink to the bottom. And the way it sank, it was going through a motion of a gradient transition. And some would go faster than others, which indicated the steepness of the transition gradient. But in all cases, it was an energy exchange. So in other words, to come down, it would have to give magnetically and receive gravitationally on each step of each flux line as it was moving. But some GANSs were moving up. Well, they would have to do the same thing. They would have give the energy and move up and take the energy to move up. So in other words, you have to drop one and pick up another. You drop one flux line and you pick up another depending on which direction you're going, up or down. So in other words, in order to move, you have to emit energy and then absorb energy. You're not sacrificing the MAGRAV condition. What you are is using the GANS as a counterweight, because the GANS has a high susceptibility of giving and taking energy, and it has a comparable affinity like water to exchange energy. And so this was the big revelation when we made the cups of life. So this field capture, what we see in singularity, is like the transaction zone of the PM ticks coming together. So that motion of coming together is the energy that is in the transaction zone that represents the motion of the car from one point to the other. And so that rotating field is what this energy flow is contained in. So we see the motion, but we don't see the field that is traveling on. Although we do like to look at the races that go around in a circle. So the same principle applies to this diatomic hydrogen. Hydrogen is not just hydrogen. There are covalent bonds. But if the poles are alike, then it's orthohydrogen. If the poles are opposite, then it's parahydrogen. And since there are two poles, then they're balanced on both sides either way with the covalent bond. So you have the same covalent bond, but you have different countermeasures. The countermeasure being like particles repel and opposite polarities attract. But since it's balanced on both sides, the covalent bond does not change its conformity, but it does change its personality. So we can maintain that same hydrogen with different properties. Those properties reflect the countermeasure. So we look at the transaction zone of cars racing as part of the field capture in singularity twice, if we say that two cars are racing. And so we measure the rate of travel by time. So the movement from one spot to another spot, we say, well, they've covered this distance in such a time. And the competitor has covered that distance also in a certain time. And then we compare the times. So the countermeasure is by time. We say, well, the winner got there faster because he got there in shorter time. But really, when you say, well, how much did the winner win by? Well, that distance is measured by time. So we have begun to countermeasure differently from the way we measure distances and speed. So this dynamic plasma, although it's a field capture in singularity, the inertia field capture is actually in two singularities. So these two plasma fields are a substructure to the product field of the inertia field. So case in point is interacting spheres. So where you have the North Pole connected to the South Pole and the South Pole connected to the North Pole. So we see that the MAGRAV energy transfer state from a polar point of view is going in two directions, where one is the emission pole and the South Pole is the absorption pole. But when you flip the poles around, then you also have to flip the path. And then there's a crossover. And so these two interacting spheres create a view, a polar point of view. And that is that mass point of view. So you have a balance of potential and kinetic energy, and is balanced. So the interacting spheres are counterweights to each other. And there's no pump, there's no hose connecting, there's no terracing. So this means when the radiance pole flipping occurs, it has to account for this vertical emission, which is part of the feeding radiance. And then this vertical absorption, which is part of the feedback radiance. So the GANS is part of the polyatomic gradient transitioning, and through the emission, we have this magnetical plasma. So this magnetical plasma, of course, is magnetical, except that it moves. And so it has to move through a transaction zone, and when it gets to the next point, it's still magnetical plasma, but now it's gravitational. So it has to flip its poles. So it has to flip its poles from the magnetical point, cross the transaction zone, become gravitational, and once it achieves that destination, it has now changed its absorption of energy, its charge, and has to flip back again so that it becomes magnetical again so it can continue on its journey. And so it's flipping all the time. And it's flipping at such a rapid rate that you see the motion, but you don't see the intermittent points. It's just like the GANS. You don't see the gaps in the GANS. Each of the gaps is a transaction zone, and you don't see the nanopoints. All you see is the nanocoating on the copper wire. And is that all that's going on? Because there's no pump, there's no hose, there's no external force that you can see, but there is a cosmic ray feeding. And that feeding will come to that magnetical plasma. So now it has increased its charge, and therefore it's giving and moving and becomes gravitational through the polar flipping, because now we're facilitating the vertical absorption. But where's the counterweight to the cosmic ray feeding? Because it's coming from the vacuum of outer space. So we see that the counterweight is the gravitational plasma in the plasma core vacuum. It only makes sense because the core is gravitational and the flux lines going around the core are magnetical. So you see many, not only MAGRA positions, but you see the counterweight of these transactions. So all of these transaction zones are telling you that there are plasmas that we can't see that are facilitating the transaction, and there is an interaction. So just the motion of one magnetical energy moving to a gravitational point, just one motion, one singular motion, could involve very easily 5 transaction zones, because not only is there an external plasma interacting, so there you have a transaction zone, but the result is interacting with the fundamental core transaction zone. And then the sum of all of these transactions is the transaction zone of motion. So you have to look at each transaction zone as being balanced by a counterweight. You have to remember that that's what exists. It's there. You're just looking at the product of it, and it's kind of handy. So this product is the charge. So it's a representation of the magnetical emission and the gravitational absorption. And that is changed by the rotation, the speed, and the strength, and the direction. So we have the emission that's magnetical and the absorption that's gravitational. But the gravitational is at the core and the magnetical is at the periphery around the rotating fields. And that motion is the constant polar energy that is manifest by the polar flipping as it goes around and around. Every motion is constantly flipping. So the transaction zone is that gravitational falling binding point. That's just an arbitrary point of view. And so we see that there's apparently these loose ends, and they appear to be terminal, because all we see is the physicality. We don't see the substructure. Well, when you look at these terminal ends, you don't know if it's going to another physical end or another plasma end. All you're looking at is the product of the gravitational falling. So it's coming from many, many points. So when you look at the basic interaction, what we call the transaction zone at the gravitational inertia point, you have these star inertia gradients, where you have this gravitational magnetical point of view and this magnetical gravitational point of view. And so each one is susceptible to increase or decrease, and each one is a counterweight to the other. That is why you have many turning points, because factors come into play, and they're not always the same factors, so things are changing all the time. But each change is counterweight. So the concept of duality involves 2 points. They work in tandem as a partnership. And why are they as a partnership? Because one is impacted by the other. So whether you're moving from one to the other or balancing from one to the other, they act with this twinity action across the transaction zone. So whether it's in a plasmatic state or whether it's in a field state of a physical state, it's the same thing. So when we talk about ray motion, then when we look at the creation, which is a balance between natural creation and natural decay on one side, we have to understand that there's a boundary to the other side, where we also have natural creation, natural decay, but in a different energy state. And so this boundary creates this bond. That bond is the transaction zone. And you say, well, what are we bonding? Well, we're bonding one side to the counterweight on the other side, but we haven't specified if it's in physicality or if it's in a plasma state or all states in between. And it doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand that this concept of the twinity is the same when we look at 2 points of the nanotech or 2 points of the picotech or the star tech. All of them involve the twinity. So we're now discussing the intermediate GANS tech. And so we see the giving of energy in across this transaction zone, which is amplified by many orders of magnitude because of the many magnetical points that were created. So it's increased the energy and the susceptibility by orders of magnitude. And this is why we have so many polyatomic inertia gradients, because there are multiple turning points in this. And so there are multiple transaction zones, and they're all undifferentiated, all unspecified, but the structure remains the same, that star to star creates a gravitational bonding area or a magnetical bonding area, depending on how the poles are arranged. And then each bonding area can be bonded together. And they would also be in a relationship of counterweight. So the magnetical counterweights the gravitational, and it's confounding to understand that because the magnetical is so tiny and the gravitational is so large. And yet it works because the maggrav is as a counterweight in order to understand that we haven't measured the energy of these, because the higher energy state is orders of magnitude higher. So if we were to take the magnetical energy of a higher state, because it's many orders of magnitude higher, it would easily counterweigh the gravitational energy of a lower, despite the fact that the gravitational is larger and more dense. That's how the things work. So we have to understand this balance is always there. So the limitations to us understanding this counterweight is in context, and the reference is either in outer space or inner space or earth space. All of these are references to environment. And within that environment, these counterweights and their limits are based on our belief and our experience. So some of us work very hard to reinforce our false beliefs, and some of us are chosen to ignore our experience because we only believe in what we see. And that's a tough one. And it puts a tremendous limitation on our ability to move forward. So if we understand how we take a counterweight and measure it, well, obviously, scales. That's the easiest way to measure the counterweight, isn't it? Because you're measuring weight. But when we talk about the conservation laws, that's a balanced equation. But look at a marriage, the coming together, the yin and the yang. Elevators are easy to understand the countermeasure. The big elevator cabin that you ride in is counterweighted by a heavy weight. And so as you go up, the weight goes down. As you go down, the weight goes up. And so that's what travel is. That's how the counterweight is measured in travel. One moment you're here, then you're over there. And the difference is the travel. Well, lifetime memories are also counterweighted. We talk about the past and the present. So we see a direct relationship. But do we see the ancestral memory, the relationship between our RNA and our DNA? Because one is the counterweight to the other. The RNA being the ancestral memory and the DNA being the lifetime memory. So the counterweight measure, when we're looking at the physical state and the atomic state, are gravitational. Why? Because the physical state has a weight, but the atomic state has a mass. When we go to the periodic table of elements, we can see the mass. But in the nuclear state, we achieved 129 Tesla, highly, highly magnetical in a highly gravitational environment. And now we're exploring the plasma state, which, like the racing cars, involves time. These are the different counterweights, measures. So when we're looking at the dynamic plasma relationship, we have to understand that there's a horizontal transmission and a vertical transition, and there's a transaction zone in the core, and there's a transaction zone in the motion around that core. So we have this Earth space point within this Earth space field, and that is our environment. And so the creation of free plasma is to understand the creation of life with the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, which gives us the star formation of the magnetical force fields of one transaction zone. And so if we understand the counterweights, there's another transaction zone that is equal. And then we get this gravitational transaction zone, which is a manifestation of a cell, an organ, or an organelle, and it eventually manifests into the brain and the body. So we see the creation of the free plasma as a structure within a structure. And the counterweight, of course, is the substructure. So when we look at the carbon inertia highways, we have to understand that there is a substructure that is the counterweight to our existence. And if we just look at the counterweight, that too has a counterweight to its existence. So now we have a relationship and understand that there's a counterweight to both. And so when we look at the emission spectrum of our soul journeys, when we go on the transmutation training, as in the 603rd Knowledge Seekers Workshop, how do we go from the soul state to the physical state and cross the state of the soul of physicality? We can understand that there's a vertical alignment, but what we can't see is the path link and what are the forces that affect that path link, because it seems to have a very interesting pattern. It follows the rotating field and crosses the threshold of the soul of physicality and comes down to the physicality and again goes straight up back, connecting to the soul. Interesting path, interesting links. And every one of them is affected by a counterweight. So when we talk about the yin and the yang, the relationship between the soul and the soul of physicality, and the relationship between the soul of physicality and the physicality, this creates an infinity loop. And so the energy flows constantly. And one is the counterweight of the other, but not exclusively. So we say, well, there's a vertical alignment, there's an infinity loop, but then in addition to that, there's a field emission. And that allows us to this inertia threshold crossing. And where is that going? It's not shown here. But it has to be something, because what we're missing is the counterweight. So if we understand how GANS flows in water, we find that water can exchange energy. So therefore, water can give and take this energy. It is important for it to facilitate its motion. GANS also gives and takes energy. So that energy constitutes a magnetical energy or a gravitational energy. And the GANs can exchange both, because it can magnetically go to a higher energy state or gravitationally go to a more dense state. So these are the varying MAGRA pathways. We call it the gravitational intensity of attraction, which is part of the feedback process, and the magnetical outintensity action of repulsion, which is part of the feeding process. So the coming together of the creation of matter, of the electron and the neutron, are the same. And yet they're not the same. So as we explore our understanding, we have to understand the peace dome reactor involves the shielding of us. That's a dimension point. And a positioning, a star positioning, is another dimension point. And of course, there's the possession, which is another dimension point. So all of these points have a counterweight, and we can't see them. But what they are connected to is through our attention. So our community has a unity, and that unity is within the community. And it's also part of our inner space unity. So there's a transaction zone between that mental and physical bonding, that soul and consciousness bonding, that energy and intention bonding. But if we look at the basic undifferentiated beginning, well, there was a neutron. What kind of neutron? Well, I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's undifferentiated. But it created an atom. And that atom itself has a counterweight. The atom consists of an electron and a proton. But the total mass of the atom does not equal that of the neutron. So what is the difference? So we see the PM tick. The PM tick in its own has a MAGRAV condition. Now that we have that, when we combine the PM tick with the atom, we can come up with an equivalent in mass to the neutron. But there's a transaction zone. Well, where's the counterweight to that? How did we go from darkness within to light without? And where's that pump? Did someone forget that pump and the hose connection? So we see that the principal matter are the PM ticks, which are magnetical energy packs. And they come together and they converge with the antimatter, dark matter, and matter gen and create this plasmagen. But that plasmagen will manifest into its physicality when it interacts with the MAGRAV condition of the Earth. And that interaction is a field interaction we call inertia. And that's how the principal matter manifests itself into inertia density manifestation. It starts as a plasma and then combines with another plasma. We didn't say which one, but when they come together, they create this transaction zone that is at the heart of the magnetical and gravitational relationship. That's the dimension point. So we see the gravitational conformation because oxygen is very gravitational and it is non-visible as a gas, but it creates an emission spectrum where it has given us a fingerprint based on light and color. And so we have crossed that threshold where the oxygen is non-visible, but the emission spectrum is visible. And where is the counterweight to that? Obviously, a plasma field that brought the light. And we saw the gravitational tracking coming to Earth. So this is all part of the matter plasma dimension, which we are very familiar with. But we also have to understand that there's a massive physical gravitational state, which we can touch and see, but there's a magnetical plasmatic state we can't touch and can't see, but it's still part of the matter plasma. And since matter plasma is part of the feeding and the feedback syndrome, we are feedback dominant because we are focusing on the product. We're not seeing the counterweight of the substructure. And this is the plasma matter dilemma that has confounded us because we can see that the GANS state somehow has manifested itself into energy transactions, which don't have a pump, don't have an external force. We don't know where that's coming from. And we created the GANS out of nothing. And so there is this plasma state, which is contributing to the GANS state in its creation. So there's a transaction zone between them. This plasma state is actually part of the plasma matter. So in fact, the atomic, nano, and GANS state and the plasma state are all part of the plasma matter. This is how we have to understand the physical science. But there's a counterweight in the plasma matter that is not matter state, but in that exclusive plasma state. So what we're seeing is the molecular matter, that communication link between two masses. And we see that we have a gravitational and a magnetical orientation and a magnetical gravitational orientation and a transaction zone. And that's how we have created our Earth space. And atomic matter is created the same way. The transaction zone to create the atomic matter is facilitated by the neutron and the PM tick. So as we cross the threshold of matter, we see the singularity of each field and the coming together, the duality of the maggrav of the inertia field. So the conversion of that is gravitational, the plasmatic substructure being magnetical. So the star formation allows different points of view of magrav's singularity. So for what's important to us is that soul point of view and the soul of physicality point of view. Now we've come to the threshold of awareness, and it will affect our physical interpretation. Not just you, but that collective point of awareness. And that is now facilitating a different kind of gravitational view. So the dimensional star formation involves a counterweight between the magnetical point and the gravitational point of these points of view. And it's changing in energy. Because there's a continuous connection. And that continuous connection allows us to know by that connection without a pump. And we don't have to be next to each other, but we have a contiguous connection just through our existence. And since we are actually bags of GANS, if you will, and GANS is an excellent lie detector, then that connection is to truthfulness. And that's the liar's dilemma. How do you counterbalance that? Well, we have many ways to facilitate artificial awareness, where we have this generational point of view, and the artificial intelligence helps us rapidly learn that. But how do we go beyond this rapid historic generational learning? We are sitting at the threshold of transgenerational awareness, which connects us to the teachings of the Creator. So we cannot depend on the lower energy communication. We have to transcend that and move to the higher energy state, because that performs at many orders of magnitude higher and achieves a greater awareness. So we have to move from this field of supplementation that is due to consumption. It's all part of our acquired knowledge, which is actually a conditional teaching by ancient teachers. But we've been restricted from the unconditional teaching by the Creator. So this means we have a new awareness, and we can cross that bridge, that historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and the loose harvesting. So this burden that we have, humanity's cross, the connection between the soul of physicality and how it crosses the threshold of the soul of physicality, is how we play the game. And what we see in the 609th Knowledge Seekers Workshop, how we progressed, we've been able to literally move from that over-dependence on the physicality, and it's tough to see in this picture, but this is the emission spectrum of our souls and how they have been increasing in awareness, and they're literally gravitating to the higher energy state of the soul awareness. And the thing is, we see the fingerprints of the amino acid of life. Amino acids are the building blocks of life. And so the amino acids that we see are really a product of the substructure of the amino acids of life. So as we head into uncharted territories, and we are with the herd at this turning point, because there's many stars beyond the single nanomonatomic state, covering that range from decay to radiation. And there's an ancestral intelligence that is reflected in us, because we are the technology. We are the inertia product. We are the image of our dimensional convergence point. Excuse me. But this humanity inertia needs a GANS shielding point. We are confronted with hostiles, with aggression, with environmental harm. There's a lot of fear mongering, emotional abuse. What's the counterweight to that? Well, let's look at time as a counterweight. We talk about transmission as it relates to frequency. We talk about transition as it relates to amplitude. We talk about transmutation as it relates to containment. And so when we're racing cars, we use time as a measure. But we also use time as an earth space reference. We have days, we have years, light years. But zero time is an outer space travel reference. So somehow, some way in the advanced knowledge, we see the time versus zero time as a counterweight. This is what allows us to cross the memory threshold. There's a tipping point, that long-term memory of our lifetime, and the freedom to cross this memory threshold connects you to your memory. So we're well familiar of a lifelong memory, and we're well familiar of a historical memory. But there's an ancestral memory that's embedded, and there's a universal memory that's also embedded. And that is the counterweight to our existence. And it creates a strong emotional impact on our existence. And this contributes to energy. So this energy is portable. So in reference, energy state transition is either through elevation, which is the physical matter state through energy state, or inertia, which is the energy state to physical matter state. But elevation involves expansion. So we have to expand our schemes of reference to take into account the dynamic soul initiator. It could be the soul of the creator, the soul of the earth, the soul of the family of humanity, the soul of man, the soul of the body, or the soul of the cells. Each and every one of them is the epitome of life. So it all contributes as soul food when you tune into the cosmic rays. So plug into the creator, turn on the power, and drop out of your resistance and receive that inertia point. Create the pattern. You provide that pattern, you will get the energy. So you decide what you want to do, because we are the greater oneness. 613 knowledge seekers workshops, or 613 weeks in a row, teaching how to suddenly transcend the limitations of nuclear science as we move into the plasma science. And this year, on May the 10th, we have converted the diamonds of the nanocoating to gold. That's the GANS affinity of truth. And we're producing gold in mass quantities. So we're on the verge of a massive technology release, because it's hard to sleep when our beds are burning, isn't it? So it all involves a rescue of the scientific, financial, and political communities. These all are contributing to the preservation of our humanity and showing us the difference between consumption and creation. We need to rescuing all of these fields. And so this month we've been doing the transmutation testing, and that will continue next month. So stay tuned for that. But remember that One Nation Network, because it's opening the blinds, one nation network at a time. And that time is now. Our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community, because we want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused to lack of knowledge. but you get to choose, because this is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. We need the World Peace Treaty to choose it, sign it unconditionally, and mean it sincerely, because the point of the true GANS tech is to cross these polyatomic boundaries. The peace dome of outer space counters the wars on Earth space. We wonder, is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? Well, it's time to learn the history of self in a universal context. The GANS is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions. The GANS tech is the counterweight for matter state, plasma state, and universal state. And plasma science is delivered daily via the peace dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age, and I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you all for being part of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. Wow, you must have an exciting time when you go into your lab, in a way, with all these concepts and knowledge and the way you presented it. It must be like a dream in the laboratory. I'm sure you have a lot of fun. Hopefully, we'll see some of the systems you've put together, because it is a vast amount of knowledge. And I do remember that game, Stratego. Again, another war game. I was probably a preteen or just an early teenager when we used to play that. My friend had that board game. And I think did ours have a spy in the United States? I was just wondering. I was thinking they had a scout. Did they also have a scout in this Stratego game, which is basically some sort of war planning on a board? You remember that, Alex?
Well, yeah, I do. The scout, of course, was the lowest. He's like a pawn in the game, but the scout was able to take out a spy.
Yeah, no, I remember. And then, of course, was there an assassin as well, or was that the spy? All the
No,
great
the
children.
spy. But the only person the spy could take out would be the head honcho, the marshal.
But you sort of had to guess what the other one, because you couldn't see the faces of the spy or anything were facing you and not the opponent. So they kind of had to guess. Very, very interesting. But again, sort of geared towards war and taking over in a way. And that's what most of these games are all about.
Yeah, and of course, my dad was an excellent poker player, and we know poker involves lying, and he used a lot of those characteristics in the game of Stratego, and it was very frustrating because he was very tough to play against. But interestingly enough, when he was bluffing, uh, he was really very effective. But when I caught him in his bluff, oh my, the collapse of his side was rapid. And that's the whole thing. That's where the counterweight comes in. Once the ruse is exposed, once everyone knows that, you're a fraud or you're bluffing, then it's easy to overcome, because now you have confidence, and in fact you become aware of the power that you have. And this is the reality that we have to come face to face with as we are going from the non-visible light to the visible light. But we have to understand that we don't have to go to the light. We are in the light. What we have to understand is how we can counterweight that by traversing the outer space, the other counterweights of the substructure created by the plasma fields that allow us to travel between here and there.
Okay, I was hoping someone would put a question in the chat, but we haven't seen any. But there were a couple questions that we can go back to. But here's something I had heard this week on the internet, and since it's Halloween, I'll share it with you. Um, don't look it up on one of the search engines, but what kind of wood do the witches make their broom out of? Anyone?
Hmm.
Try, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but this is what was said by one of the people I was listening to in one of the podcasts or something. It's called Hollywood.
Oh my.
You think that's a joke? I do have a couple holly trees around the house, but it's not really for making brooms. It's more for protection because they do have some very sharp points on a number of points on their leaves. So I think the people had put these bushes around sort of the windows and things to sort of prevent any peeping toms. But yeah, apparently it's Hollywood. We can check that out at another time.
Well, I would have thought that maybe it was closer to hemlock, but anyway, still it's close enough. But that's a very good.
Yeah. Ike had a question earlier in one of the other sessions, I think earlier on Wednesday, and he was talking about what Mr. Kesh mentioned about the weight of the soul, or the soul of physicality, actually. Maybe we can just share the screen and take a look at that. Ike, I see you've come back in, and oops, I need to bring up the transcript. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, there it is. Let's see if we can just find that about the weight. And again, we know that the physicality is a leech on the soul. Is the soul of physicality a type of counterweight? Or does that relate at all to what you were trying to teach us about the counterweight? Any thoughts?
The interaction of the soul of physicality with the soul of man is the counterweight.
Okay. Ike, did you want to say anything about that?
It's kind of loud in here. I can't talk right now. Sorry about that.
No problem. No problem. I just thought I'd give you an opportunity to get more knowledge on this counterweight. I know the soul and soul of physicality do work together in sort of an uncomfortable relationship, but maybe we can make it a little bit more comfortable so they become closer to one another. Where, again, where we have the lion, which would be the physicality, I would think, or the soul of physicality, and the soul being the lamb, and we're trying to get them to eat and sleep in the same nest. And I think as these fields increase, more and more of us will get more of a balance and an enlightenment through this process. Gail also had something, and I know you talked about gold and other things. And Mr. Kesh said we want to go for the white light, not the gold light. And he did say the gold that he created in Beijing was an important aspect in the space travel, or what we needed to create things in space. But here, Gail, do you want to, if you're still with us? I think she is, yes. Anything about the white or the gold? I know you said some people said the gold, but Mr. Kesh seems to say here it's the we're aiming the white or transparent white is the ultimate, not gold. Any sort of question, Gail? I just thought we bring this up to Alex, or Alex, if you want to mention anything about this gold or this white.
Well, I do know that the white light is a combination of all colors. So just the screen that you're looking at, your computer screen. And, if you understand that the red, green, and blue emission coming from the diodes on the screen, creating the white image. And so the combination of all those colors gives you the white. And that's what you want. You want the connection to that. But again, you have to remember that the visible light is part of our physicality.
Right, the physical light, yes. Here he's saying the white or transparent white is the ultimate.
Well, yeah, again, because it's containing the energy of the whole spectrum. You see, even when you look at the emission spectrum of oxygen, you're only seeing selected portions of the color bands. But that is true of every single emission spectrum, of every single element. And that's the emission spectrum. It comes in lights. But when you look at the manifestation of the product on the periodic table of elements, then each of the elements has its own color. And we see the same is true in the GANSs. When we see a white GANS, well, how white is it? And, it looks like it's white, but when you put two GANSs of different materials together, there clearly is a shade difference. So, the more white it is, the more inclusive it is of all the colors. And I'm just saying that, when you're gathering up the energy, we are a product of all of the energies on this planet. That's why we're here. There is a unique connection. And, if we were to go to another planet, we would have to have that same kind of connection. But if that has different field strengths, then in order for us to go there, then we have to adapt differently. Earth is very unique in that it has a capability of interacting with the cosmic rays and their true integrity. That integrity is the white, or the transparent white, as it's said here, is the ultimate.
All right, thank you, Alex. Anyone else? And again, he said here it's the additives which change the color. Mentioning about putting a small dot in the diamond and that changes its color, but the rest is carbon. Any other questions anyone would like to ask? And again, when I put this in here as far as chips, and I think he was saying here how this has thousands and thousands of reactors, micro, mini, little chips. They are miniature reactors. They're all produce energy at a given point in a certain way. And if you go to the second patent, but where did he say there were thousands and thousands of these reactors, micro or mini reactors running on this ship? So that's quite a feat to keep all of these things interacting and running together. He said, these little chips in your pocket. I guess he was referring to the cell phone there, the way the cell phone works. And what does it have? 1 billion chips in it or something? Someone had mentioned that. Again, I can't build a cell phone. I know how to use it a little bit, but again, a lot of interactions to keep this craft going. And this is not child's play. Or you create a star formation and you're good to go. It seems like it's much, much more involved.
Well, that's the difference between the computers of old that could fill a warehouse and the computers that are new that sit in the palm of your hand.
Right here. This system, I think he was talking about the 3i, has thousands and thousands of miniature plasma reactors, which creates this condition. So again, I think of system failure and other things. So this is quite a, but maybe again, it's been perfected to the point where it doesn't really fail that often. There's not that much system failure.
Well, what is most profound about the description, with respect to Three Eye Atlas, is the interpretation of the energy as being the foundation of a nation.
The interpretation of the
Foundation of a nation.
Okay, who's interpreting that?
Well, Mr. Kesh, we were talking about the birth of a new nation.
A new race, yes.
Well, no one's talking about that. I mean, try and go to the coffee shop and talk about that.
No, again, it's hard to do. I thought that was a great example. Mr. Kesh said, how are you going to ask someone to judge a croissant when he's never even been exposed to French cooking? So when you ask someone, what do they think about this? You're probably not going to get the answer if they haven't been tuned into the plasma science much. Because this is, again, baffling, this energy dimension for all of us. We're coming into it step by step, slowly. And of course, the fields will add a lot to it. But he's getting us into a position, again, where I think we'll be able to convey or transfer certain things to others. And they will have the trust because of what Mr. Kesh has basically put forward. And as we can see, what he's spoken about, what he's drawn years and years ago, is basically matching what we're seeing in the solar system and our skies. But the scientists are going to have to open up to that a little bit more. Right now, I think they're ordered to block it. And even I was seeing some of the features on Mars, and again, many 90-degree angles and other structures. We know back in 2000 we had the face on Mars, and of course that was just the shadow. So perhaps there was even other civilizations that tried to get a start there. I don't even know, but there's certainly artifacts there and on the moon, which they really. But apparently these latest ones from Mars, beginning of this year, perhaps, you can definitely see some 90-degree angles, which nature usually doesn't work in that sort of manner. So someone has been there before in the past, or again, maybe rose up and fell down. I don't know, or left collectively.
Well, these questions that you're asking, have been going unanswered, and no one is really stepping up, if you will, to be brave enough to even attempt an answer. What was confounding to me was that, if you ask an expert, a so-called expert, and when they say that I don't know, I'm thinking, well, you mean you don't have an opinion, or you don't have a point of view, or you don't have something that you can contribute to the possible answer of that? Just flat out, well, I don't know. That's not an acceptable answer, and especially coming from an expert. But we are at the point we're brave enough to put forward a hypothesis, and any hypothesis or theory it only remains so until it's disproven, and only needs to be disproven once. So as we continue in our way, we're not getting disproof, we're getting disbelief, and we're getting a stoppage. And so, in many ways, the skeptics are, kind of the counterweight, if you will, to the progression of the advanced science. But it's a weak counterweight. We are assuming at least, I'm just talking from my point of view, we would always strive to be better at what we're doing, whether it's playing a musical instrument or being an athlete or seeking some kind of academic destination. It's always seeking a better position. I don't understand this lack of seeking for a better position with respect to our physical knowledge. Our physics, our scientific community. I don't understand that. And it doesn't compute, not in my world. And to be grossly satisfied with having achieved a plateau and then continuing on that. And I look at a scientist like Niels Bohr, and he made some discoveries at the age of 23, and that was the last discovery he made, and he rode that pony all the way into his old age. You would think that would be a threshold to open up the door and allowed him to discover even more advanced things. And it didn't happen. So really, from the time he graduated, with his credentials, and he created some thesis which the scientific community adopted, and then for the next 4 or 5 decades, there was no advancement. Well, I would say that's disappointing.
Well,
But that's
maybe he was spoken to in a way. We don't want to go too far here.
well, no, of course he was, and then that's kind of unfortunate. But we are the benefactors, or we are the victims of this type of myopic thinking.
Right.
And the thing is, there is a counterweight to this whole thing. And now we're getting some assistance, which is increasing that counterweight. So the plasma science, as we understand it, is one counterweight. But, the fact that we're witnessing a transition that is happening, and I won't say that we're seeing it because it's behind the sun, but we are seeing the product, which is the emission field from the interaction of 3I Atlas and 2D Swan. And it's interesting how the difference in that field strength is profound. So based on field strength, we could say that 3I Atlas is magnetical and R2D, 2D Swan is gravitational. But you need both to come together to create this field interaction. And they don't have to be side by side. They don't have to converge in their physicality, because what we're seeing is their physicality. So that field interaction is in a plasma state, and they're able to do that. And they were planning that and doing that. And as Mr. Kesha said, kindly took us into consideration, because at this time last week, we all could have been history. And that's, that's shocking. And that hasn't sunk in yet. But obviously, we were that close. But, when you're seeking peace and harmony and unity within the community of the Earth space and the universal community, then you have to go in a peaceful manner. And they're demonstrating that. However, I don't think they're willing to suffer the kind of restrictions that we have been suffering with. So we need to stay tuned for the next exciting episode. And on that note, I just want to thank everybody for allowing me to continue to present. I don't ever want to forget the input that's coming from all the knowledge seekers present and in future recordings.
And of course, NASA's always said they've been looking for life in the universe. And of course, we see the SETI system and other things, but Mr. Kesh has played it like the master that he is. I think he put out the bait on this transmutation, and we're not only going to see this race, we may see many more, but they were looking for life. Well, guess what? You're going to see thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, perhaps, of entities now existing within our solar system and perhaps on some of the planets, even like Earth. So you wanted to find life? Well, as he said, he sort of attracted them, even though they were still coming on this journey. Another anomaly is I haven't seen much mentioned about this Swan R2. Everything is focused on the 3I Atlas. In the beginning, a few months ago, I remember seeing things talking about the Swan and the Atlas sort of meeting together, or, they were coming in from different, one on the elliptic and another one from another angle, and they were going to intersect, but there's very little spoken about these days. Maybe that will increase in the coming days and weeks as more and more of this, I guess, gets released.
Well, also remember that the references are in singularity, and they're always emphasizing the impact that the 3I Atlas is making on the sun. Ignoring the fact that the sun is absorbing the energy of the interaction or the plasma field that is manifest. So if it wasn't for the sun acting as a shield, as I say, we wouldn't be here. And so that energy is not being impacted on the sun. That energy is being absorbed by the sun and is done plasmatically, and we're not seeing the sun suffer as a result. Although we have seen some of our physical things, such as satellites, shutting down. We've had a lot of trouble on the internet. Communications even between Europe and North America have been, affected, and everybody's scrambling, to keep up appearances. But, the key thing is that changes are afoot, and what's becoming more and more important is the importance of delivering the plasma science in many practical applications, because every week the flood of unemployment is now hitting, and we are starting to feel the effects of this. And all we're getting from, so-called benefactors, they're giving us apologies. Well, apologies don't pay the rent. So, we were coming to the point where the awareness has increased and the tolerance has decreased. And that's the counterbalance there. So thanks very much, Mark. You've been doing a wonderful job.
Alex as well, and thanks to each and every one of the knowledge seekers. As we like to say, we're all carrying a very small piece of a very large carpet, probably larger than we can even imagine. Anyone else have a question or something they'd like to bring up? Remember, the Central European time has moved back 1 hour, so it would appear that the classes or any sort of programs this week only until next Sunday will actually, for me, they'll start an hour earlier than I normally anticipate. So calculate your timers and your clocks and the rest to realize, at least in this part of the United States, we're now 7 hours behind Central European time rather than 6. So that will balance itself out on Sunday, this coming Sunday. So it's only for 1 week, but be aware the programs, depending on where you are, may start an hour earlier, at least in this area. In other areas, you'll have to determine that. Anyone else with any other thoughts or questions or comments? Let's see, I see a couple of questions in the chat. Another day of learning. Thank you, Alex, from Randy. And of course, thank you all from Alex, and Erm is also very appreciative. We're all very appreciative, and again, humbled by that we're here, and just the sort of early comers into this, sort of pioneers into this. But there's a reason Mr. Kesh has staged this particular way. We don't know all the ins and outs of it, but we're certainly being positioned to be able to share more. And I think the credibility as what we see, as Mr. Kesh said, what he's been teaching and the pictures we see and the pictures he's drawn have been proven to be correct. And of course, we expect that, I think, from a universal teacher, which we'll all become. We are becoming those universal teachers. Karina says, thanks to all of you and gratitude and respect to Alex and Mark. Yes, we respect everyone if we can. Okay, if there's no other comments or questions, we can basically close up. I'll play the Kesh coin and Hello, We Are the Kesh Foundation as a closing video before I play the final disclaimer. But just to bring up the gift of the three wise men, again, for you to apply it, I think only you can apply it. But as he said, very similar to creating a shielding, like the 3I does. By thinking, speaking, and acting good, you do create some sort of shielding around you because you're elevating more souls than you're actually sort of trying to take away from. And that's the whole idea of the plasma technology. We always add to the soul and not try and take away from the soul, as I understand it. But again, it's for you to apply and investigate. And I think it's easier said than done, as we all know. And this is where we're moving into this piece. And I could never understand when I read the holy books where Christ said you didn't have to go out and kill someone or commit adultery to be guilty of it physically. All you had to do was think it. And I guess without permission of an affair or something like that, you can just think it and you create that. But if you ask permission, then of course, if it's granted to you, then it's yours. But the idea that you can think something and be responsible for it, and again, this is how powerful, or us creating in that dimension of thinking, speaking, and acting. So your words, as Alex has said so many times, are so powerful, but so isn't your thinking, as Christ conveyed to us in some of the holy books. Not that they're all correct, as we know, most of it is grandma's chat. But this is why we promote that. And again, if you can start to master some of these techniques, which only I think you can do, of course, we're getting energies that will elevate us, then it's easier to be proud of the work you do. And of course, to be proud of the person you are. And of course, to be proud of the difference you're making. So thank you all for today.